the top 100 businesswomen in Wales. And Sophie, The Guardian has described you as the world's first minister of the unborn. How would you describe the incredibly unique work you do, why it's so important, and how it came about?
It's great to be with you today. The Guardian is almost right, but not quite. So I'm not a minister. I'm not part of the government. In fact, that's a really important aspect, because I'm independent of government. I'm appointed to oversee the way in which our government in Wales, and not just our government, but 43 of our other main public institutions. So things like our public health institution, our environment agency, our local authorities who deliver services on the ground to people, to oversee how they are doing something really important, which is set out in our legislation, which is how they're acting in a way which meets today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Those people who might have a background in sustainable development will recognise that that definition, if you like, from something called the Brundtland Commission. But our law, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, requires our public bodies to demonstrate that. It also requires them to contribute to 7 national long-term wellbeing goals that are set out in the law, and to display 5 ways in which they are going to work, or in which they're working. So how they're thinking and planning for the long term, and recognizing the long-term consequences of the things that they do, how they're acting to prevent problems from occurring or getting worse. And we can all think, I can imagine, of multiple problems that should have been prevented, how they're recognizing the connections between different things, how it's, how poverty affects your health, and how your health is also affected by, whether you live in areas of high air pollution and so on. To integrate their thinking, to collaborate with each other, and to involve citizens. So my job is to check how they're doing that. And in the law, my job description is to be the guardian of the interests of future generations of Wales. So no pressure there or anything.
None whatsoever. Now, Sophie, how did you come to this job? Has this always been a passion? How has it come to you? How did you come to it?
Well, I grew up in a part of Wales, in our capital city, in an area that was often in the headlines for the wrong reasons. So an area of high unemployment, high levels of domestic abuse, poor attainment of children in the education system, and so on. And I was the first in my family to go to university, but I've taken those experiences from the area that I grew up throughout my career, particularly this sense of social injustice, if you like. So the fact that I actually ended up going to a school in a more affluent suburb because my grandparents lived there, and that meant, I think, that the opportunities that I had in my life were different from the opportunities that the kids I played in the street with had. And that's, that irritates me, that frustrates me, that gives me this deep sense of kind of injustice, that the place where you're born can determine your future. But what if we pose that question about the time that you're born and how that determines your future? So if you're born, if you've been born this year or over the last few years, some estimations suggest that 65% of children entering primary school, as we call it in the UK, or kindergarten, will go on to do jobs that don't even exist yet. We know that there's going to be a huge challenge in terms of the economic consequences and just the life consequences in terms of climate change, for example. So those things have kind of really motivate me. And I've always had a background in public service, but also in politics. I was the youngest councillor in Wales. I was elected at age 21. I could see how the system didn't work for young people, how it was dominated by older generations who perhaps didn't have the insight of what the world was like for younger generations. And that was 20 odd years ago. now, and things have changed so rapidly. So, you know, our young people now are what we describe as digital natives. So they've grown up, you know, with technology. They've grown up with iPhones. They've grown up with that technology at their fingertips. And for someone, or not just for someone, for a whole set and swathe of people who are running our democracies and running our public services, who are perhaps in their mid to late 50s, that is something that perhaps they just do not understand. So that passion and background, I suppose, in terms of wanting to, you know, address social inequality, how you can see that that's linked to environmental inequality, and how we need to ensure that we have diversity in our decision making, and that includes diversity of gender, of race, of religion, of disability, but also diversity of age and the different perspectives that people of different ages bring.
Thank you, Sophie. What you described now, and also what I understand about the 7 goals of your work, is that they are hugely aspirational, and rightfully so. I'm quite curious as to how you work with different parties to turn this aspiration into action.
It's a really good question. And, you know, one of the criticisms of our legislation amongst people who are trying to implement it is that it's too aspirational and it's not grounded in reality. But, you know, I wasn't responsible for passing the legislation. I'm just appointed to oversee its implementation. But, you know, I think we should make we shouldn't be making excuses for the fact that it's aspirational, because what it sets out through those 7 wellbeing goals is a set of long-term aspirations for Wales, and those aspirations were devised in conversation with the people of Wales. So over 10,000 people across Wales took part in a conversation called The Wales We Want. So we posed the question, what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children and your grandchildren and future generations to come? But they're also drawn from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So both of those aspects come into setting our wellbeing goals. And I think although they are very forward focused and future focused, so if you look at our goal of prosperity, for example, it talks about a productive, innovative, low carbon society. It talks about an economy which uses resources efficiently and proportionately. It talks about acting on climate change. It talks about our population having the access to skills which will enable them to acquire decent jobs. Nowhere in our definition of prosperity is anything about GVA or GDP, which has tended to be the dominant factor in terms of, you know, most policy making across the world. And I think, you know, us putting a marker down in terms of that different and progressive approach, saying that GDP is a means to an end, not an end in itself. So GDP growth, you know, growth is not the goal. The goal is well-being. And if GDP helps us to get towards that wider well-being, then great. But it's not an end in itself. But back to, so how is it implemented on the ground? So as you can imagine, what we're trying to do here in Wales is change the habits of very many lifetimes. So of short-term decision making, short-term performance measures. So, you know, in Wales and in the UK, we're fortunate to have a National Health Service, which is, you know, absolutely brilliant. The problem, however, is that we measure things in our National Health Service by the amount of time it took you to get treated, the amount of time it took an ambulance to turn up, how satisfied were you with your appointment with your doctor, those sorts of things, you know, all things that probably we want to know. The thing that we're missing, however, is the bigger picture about health is how satisfied are you with your life? Why are you in an ambulance in the first place? Were those conditions preventable? And what could we have been doing as a society to prevent those conditions? And we know things like poverty and, you know, and as I said, air pollution and various other factors affect our health. So it's about trying to get people to think about those wider determinants and those sort of root causes of issues. And we're seeing some significant progress in that. So I'm just going to give you one quick example of many. So in Cardiff, our capital city, the Act has brought out this joint sort of partnership working between a number of different agencies. And as a result of that, that saw the public health consultant be seconded to the local council to lead on the development of a transportation strategy. Now, that's interesting in itself, because when you apply a public health lens to a transport problem, you get a completely different set of solutions. So if we'd given that to an engineer, a highways engineer, we would have seen more roads. If you give it to a public health consultant, what we start to see is mass investment in bikes for hire, mass investment in cycling and walking infrastructure. We're targeting that investment at those areas that have the highest level of air pollution, the lowest levels of life expectancy. In the process of developing that cycling and walking infrastructure, we're doing that using green infrastructure. So we're cleaning and greening communities at the same time, because those poorer communities are much less likely to have access to nature and to be able to benefit from the health benefits of that. So that's just one small example, and I could talk for the whole hour about some of the bigger strategic examples of how our interconnected goals are being applied in practice. But I'm not going to kid you and say that this is easy, because this is changing deeply entrenched ways of working, which have been about working in the short term.
Sophie, I read about the Cardiff case study, and one of the insights that I absolutely loved was that now doctors or physicians are able to not just prescribe statins, but they can actually prescribe free bike rides for people, because they know, well, first of all, the infrastructure is there, and they know that bike riding is healthy, or it will contribute to overall well-being and health, which I thought was fantastic. Now, Sophie, I'm quite curious as to where accountability lies. So the picture that you've just painted was a really fantastic one of different partners coming together in an interconnected fashion, and I can absolutely see the benefit of it. But how on earth does one drive accountability?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're talking about accountability for implementing the legislation, so some of that rests with me. So my job is to both advise and support our public institutions on how they go about meeting the requirements of the legislation, but also to monitor and assess their progress. So it's important to say, I can't stop anyone doing anything or require them or force them to do anything. I'm not democratically elected. I'm an appointed independent commissioner. So, in some ways it's right that I don't have the powers to do that. What I can do, I suppose the harshest of my powers are name and shame powers. So I can go into institutions, look at things, look at the way in which they're implementing the legislation, look at some of the decisions that they've taken or perhaps not taken that they should have taken, and give an assessment and call them out, if you like, in terms of how how they're implementing the legislation. And I think the beauty of it is that the minister who passed this legislation, who carried this legislation through our Senedd, our Welsh Parliament, described it as the Common Sense Act. Now, I often say, or people say, well, so why do you need to legislate for common sense? Well, it's because, unfortunately, common sense isn't that common in public policy making and, and politics, sadly. But when you present it as, can you explain to me why this thing that you're going to do, or how this thing that you're going to do is going to contribute to improving people's health, to improving the economy, to making sure that it's not impacting on the environment, to protecting and enhancing nature and biodiversity. And if you haven't thought about all of those things, quite frankly, your decision-making process is flawed. So it's actually very difficult for people to argue against the principles of the legislation. So when they're being called out for not implementing it, they often change their minds, and we've got some brilliant examples of where that's happened.
That's fantastic. Now, having a look at your website in preparation for this talk, I came across something called, I think it was The Art of the Possible and Simple Changes, which I found fascinating. Please tell us about that.
So this was a programme of work that I undertook as part of my my duties or my powers to provide advice and support to public bodies. And it's really, as I said, we've got these 7 national wellbeing goals, which cover everything from being globally responsible to a prosperous Wales, to a Wales of cohesive communities and a more equal Wales, and so on. And what I was trying to do was to set out what are the things that you would do then, what are the actions that you would take in order to get towards that, towards those goals. And we set them out from, okay, here is a menu of simple things that you could do to contribute to this goal. One of my favourite ones, on the goal of a resilient Wales. So this is about ecological resilience, is about enhancing and maintaining nature and biodiversity, recognising the nature crisis that is upon us. So a really simple change for some of our organisations is to stop cutting the grass. So our local authorities spend millions of pounds every year mowing grass lawn verges and mowing fields and doing all of these sorts of things, when actually in a large number of cases a much better thing to do would be to instead plant wildflowers. Now that is good for nature. It's good to attract pollinators, bees, to to come to those wildflowers, and we know some of the challenges in terms of our pollinators. It's great for communities because it actually looks more attractive, and actually it's going to save you money as well because you're not mowing the lawn. So it's a simple thing where I suppose there's just a bit of a challenge of, if we pause for a moment and think about the things that we've always done, is there a different and better way of doing it which makes a contribution across our wellbeing goals? And what we've started to see now, in fact, I walked my dog in the local park, and just a few weeks ago, the council there, they've cordoned off a space in the park for nature, for wildflowers and so on. And they put a big sign there saying the reason why we've done it, explaining to the public, the reason why we've done this is because we've got this problem in terms of a nature crisis. We're trying to attract bees and pollinators. So they've actually gone a step further, and they're actually building in education to that as well. And eco-literacy and understanding is, again, an important part of us all playing our part in protecting the environment. So really small things that could make quite a big difference. And then we take them on a journey to, these are the sorts of things that you might do if you were being more adventurous, and these are the sorts of things that you would be doing if you were really owning your ambition. And then, we're aiming towards leading the way, make Wales lead the way in the world.
I love that example, and I feel really good about the fact that I haven't mowed my grass verge in about a year. So thank you for that. Sophie, you spoke about taking the time to pause. Now, I'm going to make the assumption, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to assume that COVID-19 perhaps put a pause in some activities and in others perhaps accelerated them. Can you speak to us a little bit about the challenges that COVID presented, particularly last year, and potentially still presents now?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's been a fascinating time, sadly, fascinating in a negative way, but also fascinating in, in terms of us identifying perhaps and pausing to reflect on the things that matter in life and the things that make life worthwhile. So I think at a personal level, many of us will have recognized the value of our relationships when you're prevented from having those relationships because of lockdown. We will have recognised the value of community, and again, one of our goals in Wales, our wellbeing goals, is a Wales of cohesive communities. And every other year, we monitor against 46 national indicators how each of the goals are progressing. And what's fascinating is that 2 years ago, through our national survey relating to those indicators, the people of Wales were asked, is there a sense of community in the area that you live? And 52% of people said that there was a sense of community. Last December, so, in the middle of COVID, after lockdown and so on, they were asked the same question, and that had gone up to 74%. So in the space of 2 years, a jump of 22%, because we can see, I think, that community response to COVID. I think it's perhaps awakened and enlightened some of our public institutions to say, actually, what we need to be doing is working with communities, not doing to communities. We recognise that in in terms of this sort of, urgent and emergency response, we have to rely on communities to be able to provide that, because we don't have the resources or the in-depth knowledge of particular communities or so on to do that. So that's been really fascinating. And then, of course, people connecting with nature. So, accessibility to open space and places that you can go walking in your locality and so on have been so important during lockdown. And I think people have had that real sense of, I'm quite lucky because I can access nature. But if I'm living in poverty in an inner city community where access to nature just, in many cases just doesn't exist or is not within reach, I think it really exposes that kind of inequality. And then if we go back to those people who fared worse during COVID and the things that has exposed. So the precarious nature of work, the fact that the people who, certainly from a UK perspective, have been in receipt of the furlough payments, have been ones who have generally been in sort of steady, steady employment. The people who've fallen through the net are the people in the gig economy, the people who are on 0-hour contracts, those people who are already in work, living in work poverty. And I think that's exposed this sort of long-term issue around the nature of work, because there's rapid increases in people working on a freelance basis, working in the gig economy, working on 0-hour contracts, and so on. And then back to the health issues. So again, those people who have fared worse as a result of COVID, more likely to catch it, more likely to die from it, are those people who are living in poverty. So it's exposed those health inequalities, which I feel that they're a bit like climate change. We cannot say that we don't know about them. We cannot say that we don't know that if you live in poverty, even in my city here, from the north to the south of the city, 5 miles, there's a life expectancy gap of about 10 years. And that's as a result of poverty. So it's exposed many of those things. But let's talk about the positives. So I think it's also accelerated a huge number of interesting trends. So something that I was particularly involved in prior to the pandemic, and we had one of our early significant wins on, was an issue around building a 13-mile stretch of motorway through a nature reserve because we had a problem with congestion. And I asked the government to explain how that was in the interests of future generations, how that was in line with our carbon emissions targets and the goal of a healthier Wales, and how it applied the Future Generations Act. And I'd asked them to look at future trends. So the rise of home working, the capacity in terms of digital working, and so on and so on. And everyone told me, no, you're mad. If you think that that's going to solve the problem anytime soon, no, it's that futures woman talking nonsense again. And there we are, it's happened. 30%, the government have now set a formal target for 30% of people to continue working from home. And if we're able to do that, what that means is that problem with congestion is significantly reduced. And actually the government, following that intervention, cancelled the road building programme.
Sophie, I think it might just be me, but you've paused. I'll just give you a few minutes.
Am I back? Am I back?
Hi everyone, this is Joe Waters, the CEO of Capita. It seems like we may have just lost Nicole, and I apologize for that. Sophie, I can hear you just fine. Thank you. And it looks like Nicole will probably just join us, but I would like to maybe turn now to see if we have any questions from the audience. Go ahead and open up while we see Nicole can join us. But thank you, Sophie, for being here and for this contribution today. I think I'd like to ask you about the work that you all are doing around adverse childhood experiences. This seems to me to be just an absolutely critical role for your position, and it's also something that's really we see as a source of great trauma, both now and in the future, that's really going to change future directions for countries and communities. So could you just talk to us a little bit more about that work?
Sure. So for a long time, I've had a particular passion in respect of addressing childhood adversities. But in this role, I think that there's no better example really of how thinking to the long-term, planning around preventative actions, integrating interventions and so on can actually produce much better intergenerational outcomes. So in Wales, about 14% of our adult population have experienced 4 or more childhood adversities. So for those people who might be new to ACEs, that's sort of defined as growing up in a household where there's domestic abuse or substance misuse or mental health problems, parental separation, or incarceration, for example. And for those young people who've experienced 4 or more of those things during their childhood, so they're 20 times more likely to end up in prison. I think they're 6 times more likely to have a teenage pregnancy, 15 times more likely to be, drug users, 3 times more likely to have long-term respiratory conditions. So even if you don't look at that from a moralistic perspective and an ethical perspective, if your thing is finance and meeting demand of public services, if we get up front of those issues, we're going to be preventing the demand in the criminal justice system, in our health system, and so on further down the line. So I'm really pleased that I've made it a priority of my office to focus on ACEs, and we have something called an ACEs hub who's providing hand-holding expertise and guidance to our public institutions as well. 16 out of our 19 public services boards, so this is a culmination of all public services in each part of Wales, have made tackling ACEs a priority. And so what we're seeing now is a range of earlier interventions in childhood adversity. So first of all, we've got ACE screening happening, so the training of frontline public professionals, police officers, midwives, health visitors, GPs, teachers, to spot the signs and symptoms of childhood adversities. And then we've got early interventions teams going in and working with those families and with those young people to try to tackle whatever the issue is. Aligned to that, we've got a huge range of things going on around tackling domestic abuse and violence against women. About 80% of the kids on our child protection registers are there for issues related to domestic abuse. So we've got some interventions going on there, particularly recognising that my last job was in the police service. So some of the things that we did there is we shifted resources from policing towards our health service, because health visitors, GPs, doctors, midwives are much better equipped to spot and intervene earlier in domestic abuse and the subsequent ACEs than when you get to a police officer intervention, which on average a victim has experienced about 35 incidents of domestic abuse before they even call the police. So it's about that kind of working together, taking a preventative approach and a whole system approach to tackling ACEs. And just this week, the government have issued a statement reprioritising, again, work in this area.
Great, thank you. We have several questions that are coming in now, and I'm going to go ahead and turn to those. And the first one we got was actually about managing the work of the criminal justice reform space. And I think, one thing that I would see is that there's a short-term satisfaction that comes with locking somebody away. So how are you thinking, maybe beyond what you just said, how are you thinking about how you engage with that criminal justice reform movement that's really worldwide, but heightened in light of Black Lives Matter here in the United States in particular.
Yeah. So in actual fact, because of so obviously the Welsh Parliament is a devolved Parliament, and the Welsh government is a devolved government as part of the UK government. So the Welsh government doesn't have responsibility for policing in the UK. That remains at a UK level. So our legislation doesn't directly impact upon the police. However, because there are 4 police services in Wales, and the way in which they deliver their services, clearly they have to work with devolved partners in our social services, our education system, and so on. And so many of the things that they are now doing are aligned with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So, for example, we have a focus on a youth offending model, so trying to make sure that where we see a youth offending, we are intervening earlier, that we are not criminalising young people, and that we're working to address their needs so that they're not an ongoing part of the criminal justice system. In some parts of our police service areas, we've extended that now to 18 to 25-year-olds, so recognising again that youth system needs to be extended further, and we're taking the same principles. We've got something called a Women's Pathfinder project, which is around addressing the root causes for women in particular as to why women may enter the criminal justice system. And again, some of those root causes are exploitation and abuse, and so on. And so there's a very sort of focused earlier intervention approach here in Wales, although there are not specific legislative requirements on our criminal justice system from the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act.
Wonderful. Sophie, what type of insight, argument, or experience do you think is most effective at converting politicians to long-term thinking, and what connects to their motivation?
I think that people often ask me, so how do you meet the needs? Are you sort of writing off current generations when you're trying to meet the needs of future generations? And my answer to that is that it's not. They're not mutually exclusive. Find the things and start with the things that are good for all. So if I give you an example, one of the things that I've been pressing the government on, and which they're now making some quite good progress on, is improving the quality of people's homes. So why does that help everyone and help us across a number of wellbeing areas? Well, it helps current generations because we have about 24% of people in Wales living in fuel poverty. So by improving the quality of their homes, and particularly around energy efficiency, we're reducing their fuel bills of the people living in the here and now, and taking them out of fuel poverty. We're also, in the long term, addressing our carbon emissions targets because we're reducing emissions from housing. If we invest government money in those areas, we are helping to create jobs. So that's giving jobs to our current generations, and that will have a long-term impact in terms of addressing intergenerational poverty for future generations. And if we're investing in our homes, in our communities, we're improving our communities, and that has a long-term impact as well. So I think you've got to start with those things that have got multiple wins. I think you also have to make those connections. I was a politician a number of years ago. I've been in rehabilitation. I'm now clean. I think that you have to understand the things that press politicians' buttons and the particular causes that they may have, and you have to show how those connections are made. So environmental justice is a racial justice issue, because why is it that people living in the global south are going to be the hardest hit from climate change? Why is it that Black, Asian, minority ethnic people living in our inner city communities are more likely to be living in areas of high air pollution, are less likely to have access to nature. So when we start bringing those things together and making the connections, I think that there are ways of addressing the interests and the particular interests of politicians, and showing them how those connections can be used to do good things both now and for future generations.
Brilliant. Do you see this as a unifying concept potentially for highly polarized societies? And what was the journey to get this office established? I'm not as familiar with Welsh politics as I am with American politics, of course, but the context here would be, any sort of long-term thinking becomes immediately fraught and viewed within the framework of a highly polarized political environment. So curious to see if you see this as something that can unify us and perhaps advance transpartisan progress.
Yes. So, I mean, I think our legislation started off as a commitment, a political party commitment, which simply said we will legislate for sustainable development. Now, if it had remained as a Sustainable Development Act, I think that it probably would have been something that environmental NGOs and organisations had particularly engaged with, but it probably wouldn't have had much traction beyond that. When you start talking about concepts of future generations, so I'm talking about your children, your grandchildren's children, and so on, that becomes an issue which can, connect and unite people. And I think it is about having those conversations. What is the sort of world that we want to leave behind to our children, our grandchildren? Because if we carry on as we are in Wales and indeed, in the US and in many parts of the world, there will not be a planet left to leave behind to our children and our grandchildren. And I think that's why Roman's concept of, the good ancestor, it's not our right to use the planet, for all of our resource needs, or the resource needs that we believe that we have now. It's our responsibility to ensure that there's a planet to be left behind for future generations. I also think the other aspect of the Act is this holistic nature of things. So I just mentioned the fact that perhaps when you talk about sustainable development, it's, if you ask the average person on the street, they would probably say it's something to do with the environment. But when you put it in the context of the things that are really important for future generations, yes, it is the environment, but it's also good health. It's also what our communities look like. It's also whether our society is equal. So we have our public health institutions and our health institutions describing the Future Generations Act as a public health act. So they are, fully behind it. We have our environmental movement calling it, an environment act. And then we have those two things connecting with each other. So we now have, and back to the point on adverse childhood experiences, we have officers in our Environmental Protection Agency, so it's called Natural Resources Wales, who through this act are now looking at what part they could play in addressing childhood adversities. Now that's where you start seeing some really interesting connections in everyone focusing, okay, what are these big long-term societal trends that will either help or hinder us getting towards this aspiration that we have for our children, our grandchildren, and what's our part in addressing them.
That's wonderful, and we at Capita have actually called for a comprehensive national child and family policy here in the United States that is focused on mitigating the effects of the negative effects of adverse childhood experiences and rallying around the flourishing of today's children and future generations with an all of government approach. So really happy to hear that the folks at Natural Resources Wales are thinking through what impacts they can make on mitigating the effects of toxic stress and adverse childhood experiences. So what have they come up with? What are they doing?
So they are doing things like social prescribing. I don't know if that's a term that you guys use, but things like how can we be using our natural environment, the natural resources that NRW manage, into things like walks into nature, connecting young people back into nature, how it can improve mental health. how we could be doing things like establishing intergenerational community allotments. So you'll be aware that, you know, one of the mitigating factors for childhood adversities is the kind of the solid adult or the always available adult who provides those sorts of protective factors. You know, what could that look like in terms of using some of our natural resources and environmental kind of capacity around that. But they are kind of, so in each of our areas, Natural Resources Wales are part of a board which looks at the issues of ACEs and a range of other things in each area. And they will be making their own individual contribution based on what's right for that area.
That's fantastic. Sophie, what are you seeing from other countries and other communities as they look to your position, and maybe they're asking you how can they advocate for a similar position? Maybe some other places have something that's you know, a little bit further down the line of development, maybe some legislation like the Wellbeing Act. What are you seeing globally in terms of this government taking up this responsibility for meeting the needs of future generations?
Well, we've had a huge amount of interest from a huge range of different countries, from South Korea, who have set up a parliamentary committee, an institution for the future, who advise parliamentarians on future trends and scenarios which they need to be taken into account. There is an alliance of governments for well-being economies. So this is this kind of shift towards GDP being a means to an end, and how do we ensure that what a government does has as its primary focus contributing to the well-being and happiness, if you like, of its citizens. So they are countries such as Scotland, Finland, Wales is a key part of it, New Zealand, who you may be aware of, set their spending priorities around well-being priorities. We've even seen countries like the United Arab Emirates, where actually they have, I thought I had possibly the coolest job title in the world until I met the Minister for Happiness in the UAE. But they have a big focus on well-being. So they have taken some aspects of our Future Generations Act into their national well-being policy. And then we're seeing sort of other parts of the UK. So there's a private members bill going through the UK Parliament at the moment to have a Future Generations Act for the UK, and some commitments in Scotland to have something similar. But I think that internationally, there seems to be 2 or 3 different camps. There's countries who are really focused on sustainable development goals. There are countries who are really focused on well-being, and then there's a smaller number who are focused on kind of future generations. What our legislation does is bring all of those things, those 3 aspects together, because they are so interconnected and interrelated. And what we really want to see is, and this is something which we've been discussing, over the last year or so, particularly with United Nations, is the United Nations having a High Commissioner for future generations, and them really then using their power and influence to promote that approach with their member states too.
So we're coming here close to the end, and I want to apologize. Nicole is WhatsApping me right now. Somehow her internet is not working, but she has a couple more questions that she wanted to make sure we got to, and so I'm going to ask you those. The first is, Sophie, I believe you're a mother of 5. What sort of characteristics do you think we need to foster in our children today that would result in them being better ancestors as adults?
Oh, great question. So I think, so one of the areas that I've been focusing on in terms of my challenge to government has been around skills for the future, and whether our education system is equipping our children and young people with the skills that they will need, not just to go into a good job in the future, but to have a life well lived and to be global citizens. So we have to recognize that we're not just global consumers, we are global citizens as well. So there are a few characteristics which I think are particularly important. So the ability to challenge and speak your mind, and particularly challenge the status quo and question the status quo. So critical thinking in that regard. creativity, so bringing creative or finding creative solutions to problems. Cooperation and collaboration, because no one sector, organisation, government can solve some of these big world challenges on their own. And the sorts of things that we need to happen is we need engineers to recognise that they might be able to provide an engineering fix to a problem, but unless they've brought the politicians or the people with them and have got people on board who have those skills to do those things, they're not going to be able to deliver some of those solutions effectively. So that kind of bringing together of what I describe as unusual suspects, realising that there are other people out there who have ideas and perspectives who can make your idea even better and make your idea fly. And then I think it's critically important that our children are eco-literate, so are understanding their place in the world and how their actions and the actions of the society that they live in are either helping or hindering the ongoing sustainability of the world. So our new curriculum in Wales very much focuses on a number of those aspects, alongside this sense of kind of health and well-being, because I think that we put too much emphasis on educational and academic attainment and not enough emphasis on building children and young people who are mentally and physically well and resilient, and have those kind of critical skills that I just described for the future.
Wonderful. And what role does, in terms of literacy, the Welsh language play in all of this? And we hosted a roundtable with some colleagues from Australia a few months ago on Indigenous languages and teaching Indigenous languages in early childhood. And that is how a lot of ecological knowledge is preserved and passed on to the next generation. So I'm curious to know sort of where you all are seeing the role of the Welsh language in the future, and passing on literacy in Welsh as a means of both identity and also this eco-literacy you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So within our legislation, if you talk about sustainable development, you will often hear about the 3 pillars of sustainability: social, economic and environmental sustainability. We have a 4th in Wales, which is social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being. So that's recognising these sort of connections between them all. And I don't know if you or anyone who's listening in may have visited Wales, and I hope one day you do, because our culture, our heritage is steeped in the language and in our natural environment. So we are incredibly lucky to have some of the most beautiful natural resources available to us in Wales. And that very much is part of our culture. So the language is critically important. So we have a target here in Wales because it's regarded as it has been regarded as a minority language. We have a long-term target in Wales to reach 1 million Welsh speakers. So that's 1/3 of the population speaking Welsh. We have Welsh my own children. I'm a partial Welsh speaker, not absolutely fluent, but my own children go to Welsh medium school, so they learn everything through the medium of Welsh, so they're completely bilingual from age 3. And I think that those sort of connections between the language, the fact that the language are the strongest parts of, or the strongest, strongholds of our language are in our areas of natural heritage and environment. There are clear connections there. And I suppose, that added element of having culture as part of our pillars of well-being is really, really important.
Great. So Nicole's final question for you, Sophie, was what advice would you give folks who are seeking to create more space for long-term thinking in their own organizations?
So there are, I mean, let's start with some practicalities and sort of tools that are out there. So there's something called the Three Horizons toolkit, which if you have a look on my website, futuregenerations.wales, there's a toolkit and a guide to how you use that. That basically enables you to think about, what your long-term goals are, what innovations might be at play in terms of reaching those long-term goals, and whether those innovations are in the long term positive or negative. So have a look at that. It's a really useful toolkit. I think the other critically important bit of advice that I would give is never think of futures in terms of there being one future or in terms of there being a siloed future. Perhaps I can just leave you with an example of what I mean. So if your aspiration is to decarbonise, if that's your sole aspiration, to meet carbon emissions targets from transport, say, if you want to do that, investing in electric vehicle infrastructure is probably a very sensible idea, and we know we will need to make that shift. However, if you think holistically to the long term, and your aspiration or your objectives are to have to meet our carbon emissions targets, to improve the health of the nation, to make sure that we're not increasing inequality and we're decreasing it, to have more connected communities, investing in electric vehicles is a really bad idea, and your better investment is in public transport, because what that means is you're getting people walking or cycling from their homes to the bus stop. You're helping to improve their health. You're getting, in the space of them doing that, they're connecting with their communities, chatting with their neighbours and so on, rather than getting in their car and going off to wherever they're going. If you think about inequality, the people who can't afford diesel or petrol vehicles at the moment certainly won't be able to afford electric vehicles, which is why low-cost public transport is a better investment, and low-cost public transport will help you to meet your carbon emissions targets as well. So the point that I'm making is that I think thinking futures, you need to set out this range of long-term goals, interconnected and holistic goals that you're aiming for, and you need to test everything you do on how that will impact on you getting towards those goals, and pick and do the things that touches as many of them as you possibly can.
Wonderful. That was Nicole's last question. My last question is, what's one project you've dreamed of but haven't started yet?
Oh my goodness. So at the moment, our legislation applies only to the public sector in Wales, but I think there are huge opportunities in embedding this concept and this framework in the private sector. And of course, private sector and big corporates, as we know, are also, often, they have questions to answer about their sustainability, but we also know there are some absolutely brilliant corporates out there who are doing some brilliant things in terms of sustainability. I think if they start thinking about sustainability in that concept, in that framework of the well-being of future generations and holistic long-term societal goals, I think we could see some real progress. So the resources in my team are pretty limited, but I would love to get to a stage where we're able to have a real drive in terms of rolling some of this out to the private sector. And we've just about started it, but we've got quite a long way to go.
Wonderful. Sophie, on behalf of Nicole and myself, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and to share this incredible vision with us and your incredible work in Wales. For those of you who are watching live, who are watching on YouTube, who will watch later on YouTube, and in the days and weeks to come, I want to encourage you to stay up to date with our next events at capita.org/events. Our next conversation will be on May the 5th with Pete Davis about his new book, Dedicated: The Art of Commitment in an Age of Infinite Browsing. So we hope that you will make plans to join us on May the 5th, and again on May the 18th, when Tim Gill comes to discuss his work on urbanization and playscapes, and creating playscapes and spaces in cities where children are welcome. So join us at capita.org/.